Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard from the Global News Podcast, and we're discussing the Ukraine conflict, its origins, and where we go from here. We're looking at the key players and their motivations, and to do that, I'm joined by the BBC's World Affairs correspondent, Paul Adams. Thank you for talking to us, Paul. Now, just to begin with, we need to remind ourselves of the timeline of this current conflict. What does the map look like?
Well, look, let's take us back to 2014 if people are happy to go back that far. I mean, you could go back further, but 2014 is probably a good place to start because that's the year that Russia took over and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, one of the southernmost parts of Ukraine. It was a pretty bloodless affair, but it caused shockwaves around the world at first, and it was really Vladimir Putin's first land grab in Ukraine. Shortly afterwards, Moscow sponsored a separatist movement in the eastern part of Ukraine known as the Donbass, in two particular regions, especially that those are the oblasts or administrative regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. A war simmered on in the Donbass for 8 years after that, until, of course, February 2022. And that's when Moscow launched its all-out invasion of Ukraine, with Russian forces advancing to close to the gates of Kiev and seizing huge parts of the southern Ukraine and the east as well. The war since then has kind of ebbed and flowed. Right now, Russia controls around 20% of Ukraine, largely in the east and the south. In addition to those two oblasts I mentioned, they also control big chunks of Zaporizhia and Kherson. Those are both in the south of the country. And that's really essentially where the front lines exist now. There's been heavy fighting in some parts of that long front line, especially in the east, in that Donbass area, with the Russians slowly, very slowly advancing.
Just explain to us a little bit more about the territory that is being discussed, the territory where the fighting is underway right now.
Well, it's going on, as I say, all along that front line, but the main focus of attention has always been the Donbass, the eastern areas where Russia has been trying to extend its control over those two areas of Luhansk and Donetsk for all of these years. It has yet to achieve even that minimal objective. It controls almost all of Luhansk, barring a tiny, tiny area, but it still lacks control of a chunk of Donetsk. And it's a chunk that the Ukrainians have fought very, very hard to keep control of. There is a fortified line of communities in that little pocket of Donetsk where the Ukrainians are very much standing their ground. And we've seen an attempt by the Russians to push forward to get behind those lines, perhaps to try and force some kind of collapse in Ukraine's front lines. That hasn't really succeeded so far, but it is still true that the Russians are just edging forward slowly but surely.
And just to take a couple of steps back, remind us why Putin wants Ukraine.
Well, there are a host of reasons. I mean, I think ever since Ukraine achieved independence at the beginning of the 1990s, Russia has looked on with apprehension, particularly as Ukraine has begun to lean towards the West, whether it is membership of NATO or membership of the EU. And really, what we saw in 2014 was a popular uprising, if you like. It was known as the Maidan Rebellion in Kiev, which overthrew a kind of ambivalent but essentially pro-Russian leader, and really marked a defiant move away from Russia by the Ukrainian population. That obviously triggered a major military response by Vladimir Putin, an attempt to stop that in its tracks. The Russians have always regarded this as a kind of Western-sponsored coup against the legitimate government. That is not how most Ukrainians see it. And of course, everything that has happened since 2014, with the simmering war in the east and then the full-scale invasion in 2022, has merely cemented the Ukrainian view that they do not want to be part of Russia's orbit, that they see their future very much as a European, westward-leaning country. But for Russia, they see Ukraine as a kind of renegade part of the Russian space. Vladimir Putin really doesn't recognize Ukrainian sovereignty at all. He doesn't see it as a legitimate country. He sees it as a kind of breakaway republic which needs to be brought to heel. And because of those leanings towards NATO, which is regarded as a threat in Moscow, that merely adds to his sense that this is a process that has to be stopped in its tracks.
And why is Donald Trump, why is the US involved?
Because the US is always involved. The US has been a significant backer of Ukraine during the last few years. That has changed, obviously, under Donald Trump, from the days when Joe Biden was really the leading figure in the kind of pro-Ukrainian alliance. The United States is now a much more ambivalent figure, but as the chief guarantor in the past of European security, as the leading member of NATO, it was always inevitable that the United States would get involved. And of course, this is a kind of, if you like, Cold War revisited. This pits the United States, which since the end of communism has regarded itself as the world's preeminent power, against Russia, which under the leadership of Vladimir Putin has wanted to reassert its authority and its ability to be seen on the global stage as a superpower. So there's a whole host of reasons why it was always likely that the United States would find itself very, very much involved in this. Although what we have seen, particularly since the arrival of Donald Trump back in the White House, has been a gradual reassertion of European involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, with Europe now overtaking the United States in terms of the provision of weaponry to Ukraine, and definitely very much seen as the principal diplomatic, political, military, and economic backers of Ukraine.
And looking at the three men at the center of all of this, Volodymyr Zelensky, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, very different characters, very different backgrounds. What drives them, and what to each of them would success look like?
Well, let's take them one by one. For Volodymyr Zelensky, what drives him is the need to keep his country intact. It's as simple as that. In the face of what at first seemed like overwhelming odds, he has successfully managed to maintain Ukraine's sovereignty and has withstood the worst of Russia's invasion, even though Russian troops still are there in large numbers and occupying a big chunk of Ukraine. For him, success would be a ceasefire and then the gradual removal of Russian forces from his territory. Now, he knows that in certain parts of Ukraine that is not going to happen, certainly not in the short term. So I think his immediate goals are an end to the fighting and, crucially, the provision of meaningful security guarantees by Ukraine's European and American allies to make sure that Russia cannot use a pause in the fighting as an excuse or an opportunity to regroup and then launch another all-out assault in the future. For Vladimir Putin, well, this is all about trying to bring Ukraine back into the Russian fold, preventing this move by Ukraine into a kind of westward-leaning country, certainly to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, becoming part of that sort of European security architecture, and essentially subjugating Ukraine. The view from the Kremlin has not changed throughout the last few years. They want Ukraine to disarm, to become neutral, to withdraw from territory that Russia has claimed in the last few years as Russian sovereign territory, and that is all the territory that Russia currently occupies and a bit more, and essentially to do what Moscow dictates. For Donald Trump, of course, things are a little bit unclear. He's transactional. He is motivated by the desire to do deals, something he constantly reminds us of. He's not particularly interested, as far as we can make out, in Ukrainian nationalism or in the inviolability of Ukraine's borders. He just wants to see a deal which sees him, Donald Trump, emerging as the kind of key arbiter, a deal that brings economic opportunities, whether those are opportunities in Ukraine or indeed in Russia, and essentially also removes once and for all the necessity for the United States to look after European security, because the view in the United States, and it's not just Donald Trump's view, it's the view of many, is that the United States should be concentrating on its principal global threat or challenge at the moment, which comes from China, and that the United States should consequently be looking to the Far East rather than to Europe. Of course, one of the effects of Donald Trump's attitude is that Europe is now beginning to take more account and more responsibility for its own security. And that is one of the reasons why it has emerged as such a key backer of Ukraine.
And Paul, you're our world affairs correspondent, and perhaps it's not fair to ask you to speculate, but in a year's time, what do you think the situation might be?
Yeah.
Not fair.
I would say in the absence of a ceasefire, and right now a ceasefire seems really quite a distant prospect, then the likelihood is that this war will simply continue. And both sides think that that is a viable option. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia is winning, that Russian forces are still advancing in Ukraine, and that ultimately something will snap and that Kiev will give way. Kiev, the Ukrainians, for their part, believe that they are getting not weaker, but stronger. They are producing more and more of their own military equipment. They are seeing the Europeans stepping in where the Americans have been backing away. They know that they have achieved miracles in the past 3 years in keeping the bulk of their country intact, and they believe that they have the ability, the skills, the equipment, and maybe even the economic and political backing to continue to resist Russia's occupation. And so for both the main, the warring parties, the possibility of a continued conflict is still one that they both see as possible and possibly even desirable, because after all, for Ukraine, why would it want to give up 20% of the country as a result of some kind of Russian diktat when it feels that actually possibly the war, the course of the war, the tide of the conflict could turn in the coming months?
Paul, thank you. That was our World Affairs correspondent, Paul Adams. Thank you for watching, and for more analysis on the top stories, just search for the Global News Podcast wherever you get your BBC podcasts.